I think there's a point that I would like to, I think everybody wants to understand how the Russian political systems work. Because, in Western media, Putin is a dictator, and that's it.
Yeah.
There is no Kremlin, there is no Duma, there is no different kind of constitutions between regions, oblasts. So that's complicated.
Yes, it is complicated. And I would say the first interesting thing to mention here is the Russian constitution is still the 1990s version, and it was based on Western models. So once again, one of the biggest criticisms of the constitution coming from the Russian population is the fact that they took out the ideological component completely from the constitution, which some people consider problematic because then there is this opportunity to be sort of more Western facing than necessary, or even how do you define what you're doing and where you're heading? What is the national idea? That is absent. Obviously, for all the criticisms of communism, there was a more strictly defined ideological component, for better or for worse. But Russia, since the 90s, even though Russia now seems to be forging its own path, it doesn't really have a defined ideology, and lots of suggestions have been made by pundits, by politicians, et cetera, but it's thus far is not part of the constitution. And I guess an argument could be made whether it's good or not to include an ideology, but I would say that a lot of countries do, whether it might not be explicitly stated. They would mention things, like liberty, for instance, private property, et cetera, et cetera. Those are ideological statements. So that's the first thing. But yeah, the Russian political system, it has, the Duma, the parliament that has multiple parties. Obviously, United Russia is the biggest party, but again, the interesting thing that the biggest opponent of United Russia is usually the Communist Party, which again is not really mentioned in the West. It's presented as, there's this really strong Western liberal dissent that is not being allowed into politics. And usually it's, those parties or those people get less than 2% at best, despite all the money that's been pumped into them. So it's really interesting that you do not hear about the Communist Party. Now, it is a rebranded Communist Party. It's now sort of officially pro-religion. So you could say, are they really adhering to Marxism, or can you really be a communist and be orthodox at the same time? So that's a separate question. But you do have this large, powerful Communist Party. Obviously, people who support it are not just the older generation. There are younger people who support it too, who are more interested in sort of social equality, better access to certain things, sort of the kinds of things that existed in the Soviet Union in terms of the really strong welfare system for the general population, healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. So this is sort of what the platform is there. Sort of, I think in the US and Canada, the word social justice for more left-wing people is a positive term. For conservatives, it's a really negative term. Social justice is sort of associated with, let's say affirmative action. But in Russia, social justice basically means having equal economic access, having a strong social welfare system in terms of, basic necessities like healthcare. So this is what the communists represent, whereas United Russia is sort of not just of Putin's power, but also this more capitalist-minded Russia with less equality, with a gap between the rich and the poor. Now, that has improved, but it certainly exists. I mean, it exists in many countries, obviously, but the gap between people like to say, oh, well, during the Soviet times, the party members could, travel abroad and had all this money. But really, the gap was much, much smaller. Yes, they did have better access, but it's incomparable to what the wealthy versus the poor, or even sort of the general population. So that gap is much larger today than it had been during the Soviet Union, even for the highest levels of the party, who supposedly were these, totalitarian leaders that could just, bathe in gold and, have gold toilets and stuff like that. So yeah, so it's really interesting. So that's the first thing. Now, there are other parties too in the Duma. And obviously, you also have sort of regional differences. You have the regions, the oblasts, as you call them, right, in Russian, and you have governors that control those regions. And I mean, in some ways, it seems sometimes, I would say, to an average Russian that some governors are good and they're doing a pretty good job, but some may not be, or some sort of lower level, let's say municipal level politician like a mayor is not doing a good job. And sometimes it seems to them that the only person who can resolve it is Putin, which is why Putin has these long annual, or at least annual, maybe even more frequently, communications with the general public where they come and they ask, and there's this huge attempt to get a hold of him through video messages, emails, et cetera, et cetera. So millions of people send their stuff in, and then I guess the moderators select a certain group, very diverse group, I would say. I can't think of a Western politician that would even do something like that, because not all the questions are positive. They're not all sort of filtered to represent his rule in a very positive way. So it's kind of interesting. So there is a little bit of that perception that unless Putin steps in certain areas, that things may not get done. But I think that is sort of a typical bureaucratic issue. I've now lived in Russia, Canada, and the US, so I can sort of compare how things function. And I would say bureaucracies are pretty comparable in countries in general, right? So they're sort of, they can be slow, they can be glacial, there could be sort of a little bit of corruption or a lot of corruption at a local level. So I would say in that sense, Russia is pretty comparable to other places. So is there anything else you'd like to know?
Let me ask you. May I, Marcelo? Okay, may I?
Go.
Okay. Thank you. So I'm sure it's absolutely shocking to most of the Brazilians to know that there is a communist party in Russia. Mm-hmm. People probably don't know that.
It's a powerful party too. So
and don't know it too. That's pretty new for most of Brazilians, I am sure. But now, to this powerful party in Russia, is this an objective to bring Soviet Union back?
I don't think they're planning to bring the Soviet Union back, at least based on the rhetoric that I see. I think, again, it's more about achieving social justice and making things more equal and lessening the gap between the rich and the poor that was definitely in a much better state in the Soviet period. So I haven't really seen anything about bringing back the Soviet Union. I mean, if you look at the relationship between, let's say, Russia and Belarus, right? Some well-wishers, so to speak, from the West say that Russia wants to swallow up Belarus, but the relationship is really great. In fact, some would say that Putin saved Lukashenko during the previous attempt at regime change in that country. But it's basically, it has a separate status. So it's sort of two states, but they're really integrated into each other. And I think it's an easier way of operating rather than having a much larger entity like the Soviet Union where you're managing, it's very difficult to manage bureaucratically, obviously. So I would say that would be the point of Eurasian integration with states that are interested in that. And that's why you have a lot of opposition coming from the official West whenever Russia tries to sort of improve relations with, the former Central Asian republics, for example, or the Russia-Belarus relationship, calling, Lukashenko the last dictator of Europe, even though in some ways I almost find him more preferable to Putin in terms of, well, he's really obviously very charismatic to the point of being funny, being really harsh. But if you kind of look at his policies too, in some ways he's more clear ideologically and more, in some ways, more than Putin. So I would say there are some Russians that say that Lukashenko is sort of an improved version of Putin, which is really interesting. But generally, again, coming back to, do we want to bring back the Soviet Union? I think it's more about having this Eurasian integration and having it as a mutually beneficial concept, because obviously Russia is not integrating every former republic, the former Soviet republic. It only pertains to some of them. But I think the relationship with Russia and Belarus is a good example of what could happen with other former republics should they wish to interact with Russia in that way.